Good. Today's is a little bit tougher than yesterday's.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Good morning, guys. I hope your day is going well. We are working today on last minute stuff to get you guys ready for the writing piece. I've got another Kahoot that's up for you. I plan on doing review content today, review content tomorrow. Friday, I'll be available for one-to-one or group conversations during the morning before you guys get ready for your 1 o'clock test. So if you want to, either by yourself or with other people, check in with me about anything you need questions about. If you need to have stuff retaught or work through things or whatever, Friday is the moment where we'll have the entire morning to be able to work through whatever last minute things might be on your mind. And I plan on keeping the schedule clear in the morning. I don't plan on teaching a session at that time. But if you do want to meet, just reach out to me. If you want to publicize that meeting so that other people are aware that you would like to get together to do anything, and I am at your beck and call. And so given the fact that you are in such weird circumstances, if there's elements of review that you would like to do on Friday that feels like it's lacking, just reach out to me, let me know, and I'll be able to help you take care of that however you need. Today, then, let me take a moment to show you a few different things that might be helpful. As usual, please make sure you fill out your attendance for today so that you guys are good. We're going to be working with a couple different things this morning. I want to show you really quickly elements of happy that I want to make sure are solid with you guys before you go into the AP test. So we'll be utilizing this document right here that I will share with you. I think I've shared with this before, but I'm going to use it to pull out a couple examples for you today to take a look at how happy works. And so with happy, if we can go back here, and we'll be taking a look at a couple documents this morning. Oops, I don't want to share. Excuse me. When you think about creating your essay on Friday, what I'm going to want to be thinking about is maximizing your points by doing the things that we've worked through on your rubric. Thesis statements should be good by this point. Making a claim that is something that can be supported inside your essay. Something that does ATFQ is going to be key, so answering the full question. You should hopefully be able to do one contextualization at the beginning of your essay to kind of set the stage for your essay in multiple sentences in ways that don't bleed together with your thesis statement so that the grader is forced into a situation where they're watching you potentially double dip a piece of information into two different categories. We want to have each category showed by each independent skill. And that contextualization should be a few sentences rather than just name dropping or a phrase or a reference. We want to do that at the end to be able to extend your essay forward. And our hope is that if you do that, you'll put yourself in line for thesis statement, contextualization, and potential complexity. We'd like you to use two outside pieces of evidence. And what we want you to do is we want you to scan your documents when you guys work your way through the DBQ. And you should be looking for any gaps, any areas that the documents are leaving open for you. Because if all your essay is document analysis, the creators of the DBQs are intentionally leaving gaps in the documents themselves to allow you space to bring in outside information that would help you to then answer the question better. And you're going to want to do that, like it says on the rubric, in more than just a phrase or a reference. You want to be able to go into some detail to explain what is the outside piece of evidence. And then also secondarily, how does it connect back to your essay? How does it help you answer the question? When you look at this screen, then, when you get a document like the one that you see up here, you're going to get 4 text documents and 1 document that's either going to be a visual graph, map, chart, political cartoon, or something like that. And when you look at a cartoon like this one, like let's say we were giving you an essay question about how society changed in the late 1800s. And we're thinking about what this picture is indicating. A student who struggles on the AP test, who only is getting the lowest level of points, is just going to summarize what's going on in this picture. And in fact, many kids who will get minimum points are going to think that they're pulling off historical context or audience or point of view or purpose, because they'll do things like they'll say, this is an immigrant coming to the United States and people aren't being nice to him. That's truly what's happening inside this picture. There's nothing sophisticated about that to actually get into how is society changing or what was going on with culture in the late 1800s. So we got to dig deeper. But sometimes kids will write comments like the intended audience of this picture is people reading this magazine and it's trying to convince them that we're being mean to immigrants. And again, if you think about what's happened with that outside information, there really isn't any outside information. It's just announcing a group of people who might read this, but it's just restating what is in the picture. So when you take a look at the elements of hippo or happy, whichever one you prefer to use, and really the only difference between them is in happy, it's talking about the audience. Some teachers will use hippo as their term because they want you to be thinking about who is the intended audience, who is supposed to be receiving the information from here, and for what purpose is this happening. And so if you think about these different items right here, I typically find the easiest of these points to earn is historical context. I have kids who will ask me, should I only do this with a couple of documents, or should I only use one of these? In order to trigger the point, you must have one of these elements incorporated in your analysis to dig deeper into this document. And so when we think about it, if you just did historical context and then laid out how the document is getting into the question of how society changed or culture changed in the late 1800s, you would be fine. If you think about the way that I've taught this throughout the course of the year, though, when I'm laying out these documents and I'm analyzing them, I regularly will use multiple components of this combined with my analysis, because it then gives it context, it gives it depth, it explains the so what. Why is this important when you're thinking about the document? Why is it that we're taking time to look at this rather than just reading your textbook? So when you look at the cartoon that you have right here, this cartoon is being set up during the late 1800s. It's being created by a cartoonist named Kepler. Although the name is not one that you ever saw in your textbook, you saw multiple cartoons of his during the course of the school year. And what is happening right here is, you remember there were waves of immigrants who are coming in the late 1800s. Now, what you could do if you wanted to set up this essay is you could talk about the historical context, about the push or pull factors that are drawing this immigrant to the United States. So you could situate this document by pointing out that we had an industrial boom that was taking place during the Gilded Age, and because of all these factory jobs, workers were desperately needed in the United States. You could also reference the Know Nothing movement that was going on before the Civil War that continues with nativism after the Civil War, where you see these people behaving in a nativistic way, even though in their past, fairly recently, they have the representation of each of their families. When they originally came here, they were seen in the same light as this individual was, which is a characteristic of nativism that we've talked about in the past. These elements that you see right here are asking you to consider the person who is creating this piece of information. And so this is asking you to think about the cartoonist and what are they up to with this message? Who are they trying to reach? What is their purpose? What is their point of view? And so you need to be reading into this tone and perspective. And in particular, this artist is somebody who seems very sympathetic to the immigrants, because he's pointing out the hypocrisy that is going on with these rich gentlemen of the Gilded Age, most likely newly rich because they're part of that booming society that's happening during this time period. And he's putting out there a critique of what is happening with the treatment of immigrants now, that these guys' families were able to benefit from the American dream, but they're now becoming much more stringent about the next wave coming in because of their fear of change and these immigrants bringing in their ideas to society. You'll notice then that I've just laid out for you purpose, point of view, where I could be highlighting the idea that this is where the author is coming from but I'm digging deeper than just talking about how this is anti-immigrant. The more proper nouns I could use as well, where he might be speaking to people who are part of the social gospel movement, who are part of the reforms of this time period. He might be speaking to people like Jane Addams, who will create their settlement houses to try to help out these immigrants as they come to the United States. It doesn't really matter which of these you do. It's checking to see, though, can you do an extension using your own outside information? And so you'll notice that even though this is a document-based question, my fear that I have for Friday is many kids will be like, oh, I love DBQs because I can read the documents. It'll give me some guidance about where I'm going. But that level of analysis is strictly the point that says describe documents. The rest of the essay is asking you to get into outside information. When you use the documents to help you analyze the question you're being given, it's asking you to bring in outside information on top of the documents rather than just show that you can read a picture, read a document, and then summarize it for somebody. That's the high school part of this class. The college part of this class is being able to retain information well enough to then produce it in writing like that. For you guys, then, you'll get some text, some documents that look like this. You'll also get documents that look like regular text. So let me flash forward to this one. So you've got a document right here from John D. Rockefeller. And if we think about John D. Rockefeller's quote that he has right here, it says, the growth of a large business is merely survival of the fittest. The American beauty rose can be produced in the splendor and fragrance which brings cheer to its beholder only by sacrificing the early buds which grow up around it. This is not an evil tendency in business. It is merely the working out of a law of nature and a law of God. So when we talked about the Gilded Age, we talked about robber barons during this time period or captains of industry. We talked about John D. Rockefeller's metaphor that you have right here, where he was somebody who tended roses. He had award-winning roses growing in his garden. And if you've ever tried to raise an award-winning rose, if you allow the rose bush to keep all of the blooms growing simultaneously, all of those blooms require energy and nutrients. And so you're going to have all of these little blooms that happen all around the tree. But if you ever work with a rose bush, if you pluck off all of the other roses, all of the energy for the plant goes into the one bloom that is remaining, and it gets really big and really beautiful. And so for Rockefeller, that's his metaphor that he is creating during this time. Now, if we think about what John D. Rockefeller is up to then, if we play out hip or happy, there are kids who be like, John D. Rockefeller had a monopoly in oil, and that's why he's writing this. That's true. It's not something that is super impressive that you've brought that in. Imagine if this was asking you to consider whether the monopoly should be seen as captains of industry or robber barons. Should they be seen as positively or negatively in the view of the person who's writing about this? The historical context that you have for this moment isn't just John D. Rockefeller. Read the name and the date that goes along with it, and think about the presidents that we memorized in class to help you out with that. John D. Rockefeller is making this quote in 1903 during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. If you remember, during this time period, Teddy Roosevelt has identified there are good and bad trusts. He is using the Sherman Antitrust Act. At this time, he has now attacked the Northern Securities Company. And so he is now taking apart monopolies, and Rockefeller is going to be in his targets as well. So being able to talk about not just Rockefeller had a monopoly, he actually, for the first time, has to come out and explain to people why his monopoly isn't a bad thing. In the late 1800s, he didn't need to do that because of the fact that there was nobody threatening him. He had the politicians controlled, he had the press controlled, but things have changed as we moved into the 1900s. It's that level of sophistication with your writing that will really impress a writer. Not that you're bad if you just highlight John D. Rockefeller owned Standard Oil and he ran a monopoly, and so that you're doing this, but being able to explain deeper what's going on is going to impress people more. And if you think about the remainder of what I've got going on right here, think about the setup I just gave to you guys. Rockefeller, writing in the time of Teddy Roosevelt trying to bust up monopolies, is trying to convince Americans that the monopoly system that we have in the Gilded Age was not a horrible thing. It wasn't abusive. Instead, he is claiming that he and other monopolies are all good trusts because of the fact that they have been building mass production. They've created these great factories that are fantastic for America. And notice how I'm weaving in historical context and purpose and point of view. And so there's a way to do this well with sophistication where it doesn't need to be mechanical. It doesn't just need to be historical context is he owned a monopoly. You can weave in other elements, but the key that you need to have is, are you bringing it back to why is this important to the question? Why do you need this in order to understand? And so in Rockefeller's own mind, if he was asked the question, is he a robber baron or is he a captain in industry? Is he abusive or is he good? He would unequivocally tell you that he is a great person who has done great things. He is a religious man who has built up all of these jobs in the United States. And sure, immigrants could have been paid more, but he has now created all of these new products that nobody would have had without him around to create this mass production. Others are going to disagree with him, but for me, the key is I want to explain with this document, how does it factor into a bigger question rather than just doing document summary and then trying to knock off one of these things mechanically. It's got to be something that is woven into the argument of your essay in order to do this well. This is a tough skill. And so you'll notice on your rubric, you're only asked to do this twice. And so when we do it, we want to use every single document in your DBQ if time permits. You should be trying to do every skill on your rubric, though, on Friday. And so on Friday, you should start off with a thesis and a contextualization to try to knock out 2 points early. Like I mentioned to you over the past, in past years on the DBQ, T2 was the average score that students received on the AP test. If we can hit a 2, I don't know how much scores are going to be improving. What I do know is that there was information put out yesterday by the College Board that showed that during the AP physics test, the number of kids Google searching physics terms during the test went up astronomically according to Google's metrics. And the things that they were Google searching were words like momentum, which if you're taking a time to Google search momentum at this point of the year, if you're doing AP physics, you are failing a lot. And so what they're watching is that when kids go try to search on the internet, they're looking for like the basic minimum stuff that should have been locked in early on. Like when we learned about John Winthrop and his City on a Hill, it should be automatic like that. There are many kids at this point who are still not. Many of them have been hurt quite a bit by what's been going on over the past couple months. So for you guys, your advantage of getting 2 points knocked out early is huge. You want to strategize your outside information and figure out where you're going to place those. So when you read the documents, find the 2 openings that you can use for outside information that isn't related to the documents and be able to figure out how you're going to plan out putting that into your essay so it doesn't bleed into document analysis. That should get you 3 and 4 points on the AP test, adding into thesis and contextualization. At this moment then, if you're able to summarize 2 documents, you're up to 5. If you're able to use 2 documents to support your essay well, you've then got another point that's coming in. And if you're able to use happy with those 2 documents and do it well, you're 2 and 8. The only other points you're worried about then is, can you use all of the documents analytically in your essay? That would get you your 9. And then your 10 would come with your complexity point. And if you try to do either a complex thesis, point, counterpoint, or if they ask you to do a skill, like they ask you to do a cause, and you're able to weave in effects, or if you're able to do a post-contextualization well, that is able to explain how this topic connects to future time periods, that's where your complexity point comes in. So this is where your strategy really needs to come in. And for you guys, when you think about what's going to be happening over the next few days, like I mentioned, we're going to spend the rest of today reviewing a Kahoot, doing content review to help you guys out. This is one that I found last night that's a little bit trickier. than the one that you did previously. It gets a little bit more into detail. The person who built this one out likes to use questions that are all of the above are correct, except, which gets even trickier with your content knowledge. But for right now, we do need to ramp up our content knowledge a bit. And so this is the right time for that. But think about the stuff that I just described for you with your point totals. That's where you and I should be talking. You are a good writer. You know more US history than most people in the United States know. It's heady to be able to say that to a 15 or 16-year-old, but it's the truth. If you're feeling any self-confidence or doubt issues popping up inside of you, it's too early for that. So we've got a couple days to work with. If you need to talk to me about anything you're wrestling with, whether it's content or writing, this is the appropriate time to do so. But my hope is that you see a path for yourself for how you're going to maximize the points on your rubric to be good. So if you've got any questions, I'm checking the chat right now to make sure that I've got that taken care of. We are going to be working on this Kahoot today, though. I'm going to say, did they specifically tell us what we have to score on the rubric to get at least a 3? They did not. And in particular, what they're wrestling with right now is they need to get a look at the essays, because they walk a really fine line when it comes to the question of, do they curve the AP test? They don't curve it from the standpoint that a certain number of kids can only, like when you hear about a curve, curves in the old days refer to like a bell curve where you say a certain number of kids can get an A, a certain number of kids can get a B, and it was very competitive. Nowadays, there isn't a limit on how many kids could get a 4 or a 5 on the AP test. The breakpoints are the key, but they're not putting a maximum limit on who could get into that group. What they are wrestling with, though, is they don't want to set a number at the beginning of this because they've never seen kids try to do what you guys are doing. And so if it turns into a train wreck, and the rubric that they've set up that I've laid out for you, where I've just made it sound easy peasy to throw together this essay, you guys are all aware of the fact that you're being asked to jump through a bunch of different hoops, and it's really hard to do. And so they don't want to set up a baseline and then find out later on only a few kids crept over that baseline because of all the issues that people have been wrestling with. They would prefer to instead look at the tests, find out how kids were scoring out initially, and that will give us a better idea as far as where they're coming from. I don't know if they're ever going to come out and tell us breakpoints, but I'll be able to pretty much tell for my group, since they're going to give us all your essays back. If I look through them, I'll be able to figure out pretty clearly what number seems to be the breakpoint score, given what scores we get in our classroom. So I'll be able to get a readout, but it'll be most likely in July that I'll get that instead of sooner. I wish I had more information for you about that, though. What I also want to mention to you, though, are these things that came out from the AP testing yesterday. They did say that there were a number of kids around the country who had trouble submitting and copying and pasting from their computer systems. And in particular, what they encouraged the kids to do is make sure you power down your computer and then bring it back up again and let it update. There were kids who were running into problems because their browser was of a previous version, and because it was so old, it was having problems with compatibility with the system that they're trying to paste into. So make sure you take your time. If you've not done the demo yet, please do. If you went through the demo and you're able to copy and paste from your browser into that system, you should be absolutely fine. And so if you want to test drive it again and make sure you're good, power down and restart to make sure updates go through, we should be great. So today we're going to be running through this Kahoot. I'm going to be leaving the chat up so I'll be able to watch to see what you guys are doing. If you come across any question where you're like, whoa, stop, let me know so I can help you out about that. I did have one of your classmates who wanted to ask about, let me see here, who wanted to ask about a question that was on our Kahoot yesterday. And in that Kahoot, they had a question about, let me see here. Ooh. They were asking about the question that had to do with the Republican Party. And in particular, with the Republican Party, they were asking about the question that said, were the Republicans abolitionists? And one of the things that I had to kind of peel apart was the idea that for Republicans, were formed by people who were abolitionists. Calvin, that looks fun. I love that icon. The party itself, when the Republicans ran in 1860, couldn't be outright abolitionists because of the fact that if they were, they would scare off a bunch of people from joining into their party. So remember, the Republicans in 1860 were former Whigs, Northern Democrats, Know Nothings, Free Soilers, Liberty Party people. They're all brought together into one party. And as a result, they de emphasized abolitionism as their major issue. And you could see that with Lincoln, where throughout the Civil War, he's fighting for union first. And then he kind of dips his toes in with the Emancipation Proclamation, Gettysburg Address. There's a progression that goes on with the Republican Party until it truly does become in favor of abolitionism midway through and towards the end of the Civil War. That sort of question was one that I love getting at this point because it really gets into the granular level of what's going on with our content. And I don't want to be afraid to ask any of those questions. The thing that I am missing right now is this is the time of year that I usually get to hang out with kids who are really good at US history and have good conversations with you guys as you walk into class and kind of peel things apart. We don't get that now because we're at distance. But that's something that I'm missing quite a bit. So if you have those questions, they're totally appropriate and right for this time. So let me grab this code right here. I'll throw it up on the chat in case we have any late joiners. All right, and here we go. So all of these things are going to be true about the Enlightenment during the period before and during the American Revolutionary period, except for one of these. All right, guys. And so when we take a look at those philosophers, Hobbes and Montesquieu, we didn't talk about very much in class. We did talk about John Locke, whose ideas from the 1600s influenced Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson in the 1700s. If you chose the idea of the all of this is true except for the Enlightenment, except it inspired this, it was definitely one of the foundational things that inspired. But these except questions can be kind of tricky. They definitely hated the idea of traditional religions, strong monarchs. They were very much of the mindset that we should instead be more democratic and giving more power to the people rather than to the institutions or to the leaders of the past. Uh, Jack H is my boy who's in here. He has got all of a seventh grade education, and so he is very proud that he is in first place right now. But he is totally resigned to the fact that he's probably going to be surged past in just a little bit. All right. Which of the following is not an effect of the French Indian War? So remember what's going on with the end of the French Indian War. You have the proclamation line of 1763. So the land out west is something that is lost to the French, but it is not something that's open to the colonists technically because of the proclamation line of 1763. Nice job, Dylan. Which of the following was not a weakness of the Articles of Confederation? So when you take a look at what the Articles of Confederation was able to do, they were able to borrow money and they were able to negotiate for treaties. And in fact, you learned about something called the Jay-Gardaki Treaty, where John Jay tried to negotiate with Spain, and Spain shut down the Mississippi River to any navigation because of the fact that the Spanish at that time controlled New Orleans. And so as a result, they could negotiate. They couldn't negotiate from strength because they didn't have the power to tax. You guys all noticed that they didn't have the power to do that. They didn't have the power to raise troops, and they didn't have the executive or judicial branch. They didn't have a president or a court system. Nice job, Ty. Which of the following is not an accurate description of a Marshall Supreme Court ruling? Which of these is not one of the rulings by John Marshall's Supreme Court in the early 1800s? How you doing? You're doing great. So all of the court decisions that you see here are Marshall decisions, except for Plessy versus Ferguson that happened in the 1890s, establishing the idea of separate but equal. Marbury versus Madison set up the idea of judicial review for the Supreme Court to be able to rule federal laws unconstitutional. McCullough versus Maryland was that court case where the state of Maryland tried to put a tax onto the Bank of the United States, and Marshall determined that the Bank of the United States was constitutional and it could not be taxed. Worcester versus Georgia was the decision where John Marshall argued that the Cherokee should not be removed from their lands in Georgia. Jackson disagreed with John Marshall, created the Trail of Tears to kick out the Native Americans. Which of the following was not a part of Henry Clay's American system? System? I'm in the system? Perfect. The whiskey tax was Hamilton's idea that he used during the Washington presidency that created the Whiskey Rebellion. Be careful on your test. Remember the different rebellions that we've had. You've got a Bacon's Rebellion. You've got a Whiskey Rebellion. Keep those two straight so you're able to not get them confused with one another. All of the following have the Mexican-American War as their root cause, except which of these was not caused by the Mexican-American War? Now, this is where having a notebook handy is not a bad idea, because if you're off on chronology, that's okay. But in order that you have right here, remember that Texas had their revolution during Jackson's presidency. Tyler absorbed Texas. Then Polk started the Mexican-American War. So this could not be the Mexican-American War could not be the cause of this. It happened before the Mexican-American War. The rest of these, though, Compromise of 1850 was created because of California that we got during the Mexican-American War. Wilmot Proviso was the payment of the war costs in an attempt to try to stop slavery from spreading. And Thoreau's civil disobedience was trying to protest against the war. And the Free Soil movement was trying to stop any African Americans from moving into the territory that we gained from the Mexican-American War. Which of the following was not an effect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act? So when we think about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it does open up Kansas and Nebraska to popular sovereignty, allowing them to vote. And remember, they had two capitals, Lawrence, Kansas, which is where the Kansas Jayhawks are from. Jayhawkers were against the spread of slavery. Lecompton, which has created the Lecompton Constitution, But as a result of these two groups battling against each other, pro and anti-slavery, we had Bleeding Kansas, which united a bunch of free soilers and abolitionists to create the Republican Party. They did send the Lecompton Constitution to Congress, but the Congress and James Buchanan, who tried to ram this through the Congress, got thwarted by Stephen Douglas, and Kansas eventually became a free state during the period of the Civil War. Which is not a decade that included low taxes, laissez-faire government, and high income inequality. Now, if you still need to read chapters 39 and 40, this might be kind of tricky to puzzle out the 1980s. But the 1980s are the period of Ronald Reagan, who is a hero to Republicans. And so it's the 1960s it's going to be the period where we do not have laissez-faire economics, but the others, the 1890s Gilded Age, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, and Reagan all have that in common. All of the following are true of the populist movement in the late 1800s, except one of these. What's wrong?
Fine.
I thought you said dang it, Dad.
You mentioned the
Yeah.
I was like, oh my gosh, it.
I'm sorry about that. All right, you got it. William Jennings Bryan never won the presidency, but the other things, they were supported by farmers. They did want to restrict trusts and directly elect senators, and the progressives did carry on with many of their ideas. Here we go. Which of the following would not be a good historical context for the progressive movement? So think about contextualization. Which of these would be not very good if you're trying to contextualize a progressivism essay? Good. Civil War is too far away, and it's not in the same theme as the progressives. You could easily use the second industrial revolution of the Gilded Age to talk about the conditions that create the progressives. Easily could use urbanization and new immigrants and the populist party, who had many ideas that the progressives were then going to pick up on. Which of the following is not true of World War I? This is a trick question because many of you guys might have blown past the blue one, and this is where we need to keep you safe with your content. The Alien and Sedition Acts were the things that John Adams put into place following the XYZ affair during our quasi-war. Later on, Woodrow Wilson created the Espionage and Sedition Acts that restricted civil liberties. There are many kids who will be that imprecise on the AP test, which seems minor, but if you confuse Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt, like some of you guys did during one of our DBQs, or confuse these two, that is an error that then disqualifies you from earning those points because you're being factually inaccurate. Which of the following is not true of the Constitution? Another trick question, because when you take a look at the motivation for the creation of the Constitution, it wasn't the Whiskey Rebellion, it was Shays' Rebellion that ended up creating that. You did have anti-federalists who hated the idea of a strong government, so we added the Bill of Rights for them. Federalist Papers were used to support it, had the Three-Fifths and the Great Compromises that were included in the Constitution itself. French Revolution and Napoleon resulted in all of the following U.S. actions except for which one? Which of these was not caused by the French Revolution and Napoleon? It's the Monroe Doctrine, so it's too far away from the time period. French Revolution and Napoleon are late 17, early 1800s. Monroe Doctrine is coming a couple decades later, following the War of 1812. And so for us, when we're doing cause and effect, we've got to think about proximity to the event that we're talking about. Hey, you're the highest climber. Take a look at that. Yay. Which of the following is not accurate of women's history in the United States? Good. 15th Amendment is going to be the thing that is going to give suffrage to African American men, splitting the abolitionists and the women's right movement. The 19th Amendment is what's going to be giving women the right to vote. Remember, Republican motherhood is the role that women had during the American Revolution, where they were supposed to be raising good patriots inside their homes so that we could continue democracy on into the future. All right. All of the following are true of mid-19th century immigration, except for which of these? So when we think about the migrants who are coming to the United States, Germans are coming largely because of what they have with like warfare that's happening in the center of Europe. Most of them, and my family is a representation of that. We're very much smart and skilled and pretty handsome. And so when we think about what's going on during the time period, many of those Germans are farmers who are leaving with skills that they're bringing over here to America, and they're moving out to rural areas. The Irish are settling in the urban areas. And we are going to have these as motivating push-pull factors that are causing movement to take place. Which is not true of Reconstruction legislation? So remember, if you were not choosing the Emancipation Proclamation, the trick that you need to keep in mind is the Emancipation Proclamation only freed people in states that were still rebelling on January 1st, 1863. And so if you were in a state that chose to come back, you could keep your slaves like the border states did. Got a new leader. Which Gilded Age term does not match its definition correctly? So if you chose the gospel of wealth option that says the rich should become philanthropists, philanthropists are people who use their wealth and donate it to enrich society in some sort of way, either to be benefactors of museums or opera houses or whatever. So that term might have thrown you off. The social gospel during this time period, though, this is the ideas that are going on with the temperance movement and Jane Addams' settlement houses, where they believe that it is the job of religious people not to build like an opera house. Their argument that is if Jesus was here right now, he would want you to feed the poor because that's what he did by example. And so they're going to be the ones who are creating settlement houses and other sorts of things to help out. Which of the following is not an example of United States isolationism in foreign policy? Good. Especially what I wanted you to keep in mind was when you're taking a look at this sort of moment right here, the 14 points are trying to get us to emerge from isolationism, even though it ends up failing at the end. Nice job, Nora. Which of the following is not true of the New South in the late 19th century? So when you think about that yellow option is correct, even though half of it is something that could have been a distractor because they did start building up their own profitable industries and factories. They just never gave up cotton production. They transitioned from slavery into sharecropping. They did build railroad networks, but these railroad networks were oftentimes built by northern monopolies who would still get resources from the South, but build up discriminatory pricing for routes to be able to use these so that the South remained dependent on the North. Which of the following is not a relevant historical context for this 1899 cartoon? Are you able to see it, Jack? When we think about the contextualization inside of this, we want to be thinking about what is recently taking place that could be used as a context to understand this document better. And we've got racism happening here inside the United States, imperialism happening outside the country. Mexican American War happened 60 years earlier. And so, as far as context, it's not going to be a great context to be able to use to understand what's happening at that moment. Which is following is not true of this cartoon. So this is using your elements of happy or hippo. So when it's taking a look at Andrew Jackson at this moment, the artist who is creating this is probably a Whig who hates Andrew Jackson. This is not a really nice cartoon about Andrew Jackson. It is very much getting into the idea that Andrew Jackson is vetoing ideas that Henry Clay has created. In particular, the building of infrastructure and the one that we focused on most, the bank war, where he vetoed the recharter of the bank. And most of these individuals were voting for Andrew Jackson down here. Now, it's not, when you look at this, it is saying that Andrew Jackson's a strong leader. It's just not praising him for it. It's very much being critical of what he is up to. So, reading into the tone and idea of what the artist is doing is part of what we want to be doing with Happy or Hippo on Friday. Which of the following is not true about the Dred Scott decision? Are you? I understand. So in this decision, everything else is true. It did say that the Congress had no right to restrict slavery moving out to territories. It did get rid of the Missouri Compromise along with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It wiped it off the books, declared African Americans as non-citizens. The thing that wiped out the Dred Scott decision was the 13th Amendment that made slavery illegal. And so that's going to be the thing that is going to then wipe out any laws that are describing where you can take your slaves. Which of the following is not true of the American Revolution? You got it. Saratoga is our turning point victory that's going to bring the French in. Zoe, check that out. 10 in a row. That is ridiculous. All of the following are true of World War II, except for which one of these? There you go. Good job. J. Edgar Hoover had told FDR before the internment policy with Executive Order 9066 that the Japanese people being interred were most likely not spies or even involved in any anti-American efforts, and he didn't listen. Which of the following is not true of Western settlement in the second half of the 19th century? So with those battles that took place, those are massacres that happened for Native Americans where they were slaughtered by the United States military. Their major victory that you guys learned about was the Battle of Little Bighorn. And that provoked that huge response that we had after 1876. Nice. Which of the following is not true of the first party system? So our first two-party system is what they're asking you about here. There you go. So this is just flip. The Federalists liked England and the French liked, the Democratic Republicans liked France. Which of the following is not true of the election of 1860? So this is the moment where the Republican Party is going to replace the Whig Party as the major two-party system against the Democrats. The group that's going to leave a month after the election is South Carolina, who in December of 1860 will secede, followed by other deep southern states. Remember, Virginia is going to secede following Fort Sumter, with Robert E. Lee leading them out of the Union. When they're asked to bring troops against the Deep South, Virginia is going to reject that, and that's when the Upper South falls. This is where Lincoln has to be focused on Union. So remember, at the beginning of the war, Lincoln's focus on Union is because Virginia and Maryland surround Washington, D.C. By focusing on Union instead of abolitionism, he's able to keep the border states in the North, which helps to give an advantage to the North during the Civil War. Calvin, is that a burrito or what is that? That looks awesome. Which of the following is not a good synthesis for Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus? So what link is not a good link to be making for Lincoln's work compared to other time periods? Suspension of habeas corpus means he took away the right to a speedy trial. Now, this is something where when we take a look over time periods, you can see that there are other moments in US history where the president has put into effect war punishments for people who are seen as disloyal. The draft exemptions right here would be people who were able to escape the Vietnam War because of the fact that they were involved in college. And so it's not like the other ones that you have there. What's that? Is it a party popper? I like party poppers. Which of the following is not true of the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s? Is our internet not working? Mine's working fine, but I'm hardwired. Jack has got his working too. If you want to open the door, you can. So when we think about the Harlem Renaissance, Marcus Garvey is going to be trying to make change happen. He is not going to be successful with his civil rights efforts during the 1920s, but he plants the seeds for future civil rights efforts. 16 answers in a row. That is ridiculous. All of the following relate to the market revolution except one of these. Market revolution was the period right before the American Revolution, right before the Civil War. There you go. So in this time period, we did not have strong unions. We did not improve factory conditions. The Knights of Labor after the Civil War attempted to do so, and then they fell apart with the Haymarket riots. And so we're going to find that not a lot of progressive change happened until the early 1900s instead. Now we are on the verge of being at 9 o'clock. This is a 45 question Kahoot. We are on question, I believe, 2930. And so if you want to stick around, like I mentioned, I've got tons of free time and I'm lonely. And so if you want to stick around, I will continue doing this Kahoot with you guys. If you need to dip out and go to other things, I've taken an hour of your life that you will never get back. And so if you need to dip out because you have to, I totally understand. So we're going to keep going until everybody drops out or until we're done. The Second Great Awakening could be compared to associated with all of the following except which of these? Bye, Jack. Thanks for playing. Now, this is a tricky one that you've got because of the fact that you guys didn't study this deeply. In the 70s and 80s, we experienced what could be seen as another explosion of religious fervor. And if you notice nowadays that we have many people who are very much fundamentalist in their beliefs, especially when it comes to like questions that we're debating now over LGBTQ rights or abortion or whatever. The gospel of wealth doesn't make sense in this whole category because remember, this is what wealthy people are using to say that their idea of philanthropy is to build like an opera house for somebody. And all the rest of these are really deep religious movements that are talking about fundamentalist examination of what's going on in the world around them. Which of the following was not an achievement of the Articles of Confederation? So the Articles of Confederation was our wartime government that was used to win the revolution, expand territories out west, but it can't be the answer right here because number one, Bacon's rebellion happened in the 1600s in Virginia by indentured servants who attacked Jamestown because of their failure to fight against the Indians on the frontier. You might have been thinking about Shays' rebellion when you were looking at this. And that's obviously different. Which is an accurate pairing of a progressive amendment and its achievement? So we want to know, do you know your progressive era amendments? So the 16th Amendment creates a progressive income tax, like we talked about in class, where if you make very little money, you pay very little in income taxes, and we go up in brackets into more and more wealthy groups. 17th is the direct election of senators, 18th is prohibition, 19th is women's suffrage. Being able to name drop those in a progressive essay, rather than just saying women got their right to vote during this time period, actually being able to cite the amendment is your proper noun that makes you look impressive. Which of the following is not true of FDR's New Deal? Good job. Remember, Roosevelt created the Wagner Act that actually protected unions during this time period? Nice job, Perry. Which of these is not an example of the problems and corruption of the Gilded Age? You got it. Labor unions were not the ones exploiting the workers during this time period. They were trying to figure out ways to help them out. Who was the leader of the preservationist movement? Preservationists were the ones who argued that we should set aside national lands so that they are not touched by anybody. Teddy Roosevelt was in the leadership of the conservationist movement, set aside national parks. We could still use them, but they will be conserved for future generations so that we don't lose these wild spaces. Which is not true of the abolitionist movement. Most Northerners are going to be really nervous about the abolitionist movement because it is seen as our radicals inside of society. Remember that we do have moderates during this time period who believe in the American colonization society. We create Liberia for that. But then Garrison and others start moving in a more radical direction as a result of the Second Great Awakening. Why did the Union win the Civil War? What was the cause for the Civil War being won by the North? Good job. Remember, at the beginning of the war, they do not have superior generals. They're facing a military in the South that has a bunch of generals that fought in the Mexican-American War that have advantages over the Northern ones, which following is not true of World War One. So be careful with this question because, like it says there, the American Expeditionary Forces had a limited but key role. They only entered the war in 1917. So even though they were only in for a small amount of time, they were able to bolster the English and the French and help win. Be careful with the Lusitania during this. It's kind of like when we talk about the path of the American Revolution, where some kids will say the Boston Massacre caused the American Revolution. Boston Massacre is 1770. We don't start fighting until 1775. The Lusitania in 1915, the Germans then attack a boat called the Sussex. America forces them to sign the Sussex Pledge so that we decide to stay out of the war. And for 2 years, America is sending supplies to England, and then Germany resumes their submarine attacks in 1917, and that's where we enter into the war. 8 in a row. Very nice. Which is neither a strong example of a cause or an effect of manifest destiny. Perfect. You guys got it. Which of the following was not a cause of the Great Depression? There were multiple. Which one of these is not? So remember the time period that we're coming from in the 1920s. We do have a lack of government regulation in the 1920s. Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover want to have a return to normalcy. It does create a large gap between the rich and the poor. So a lot of people are buying using debt. We do have overproduction during this time period. But then also during this time period, we do not have a lack of technological innovations. We got tons of new technology. We don't have high taxes. We've got low taxes. And so that's going to be the reason. That's not going to be the reason why the depression is coming. Which of the following is not a relevant and accurate historical context for this 1919 cartoon? So when we think about the context that you have here, oh, sorry. This is very much a cartoon that is reflecting the Red Scare in 1919, where we are deporting a bunch of people to Russia who are seen as troublemakers, anarchists, socialists, communists. And so World War II is not a good context to use for the cartoon that you see right here, but this is related to the Russian Revolution and the limitation of people coming into the country from potential radical countries and the Palmer raids that have been attacking radicalism inside the United States. Which of the following is not a cause or an effect of the Spanish American War? This is a tricky one because if you take a look at the red question that you have right there, everything is right about that question. We do want to have plantations and have sugar. It's just not to expand slavery, since that's now technically illegal in the United States. We would love to use laborers who are being paid very little to be able to do so, but we're going to find that this element right here makes this question not right. It's kind of tricky. I like that flame that shows up right next to there. That looks cool. Which of the following is not true of Native American history? So when we look at this question, Tecumseh around the War of 1812 did try to create a pan-Indian resistance movement, which means he tried to figure out ways to unite all of these different tribes together who may have had reasons to battle with one another. He tried to unite them all against American expansion out west. The Dawes Act is one that the Dawes Severalty Act is the one that we learn about where they took reservations, carved them into homesteads, and then took away the rest of the land. This answer right here, though, the boarding schools, we saw that instead of trying to protect Native culture, they were trying to assimilate Native Americans. And so they used the phrase, kill the Indian, save the child, with the idea that they could convert Native Americans and eradicate that Indian culture influence. Final question. Which of the following does not correctly match a woman leader with her accomplishment? So Susan B. Anthony is going to be a famous suffragette as a suffragette in the late 1800s, early 1900s, up until the time of the 19th Amendment. The rest of the women are correctly matched up. Jane Addams does have Hull House to help out poor people. Ida B. Wells is writing detailed descriptions about what's going on with lynchings, and Alice Paul is a militant who is trying to push forward the idea of women's rights during this time period. Congratulations to all competitors. So even if you do not see your name dancing on top of a podium, in my heart, you are certainly dancing metaphorically and symbolically. when I take a look at the chart, the questions I have over here, Calvin, if you are still online, the chapter 41 questions, notes, we'll talk about them next week. Right now, I'm just focused on the AP test. What I do know is that as a group, our social studies department has determined that we want to try to work through getting content taken care of through next week, and then figure out ways to kind of enrich or enhance your grades from that point forward. And so any new instruction is going to be going through next week and then being done, as far as having it be having a potential negative impact on your grades. So we'll be able to discuss on Monday when those notes are going to be due. But I wouldn't have that first and foremost inside of your mind. Like I mentioned, if you are still online with me, anything you need to get ready for the AP test, I am down for helping you out. I have no time constraints on me whatsoever. And so if you need to meet one-on-one or meet as a study group, get questions answered, whatever, make sure you scratch that itch beforehand, because you've prepared so hard throughout the course of the year. It would be a shame if we leave some rock unturned that could be looked at to make sure that you are doing well. If you are good at this point, though, you can dip out and take off. Have a great rest of the day. And tomorrow we'll meet again at 8 a.m. for our last review session before your test on Friday. Thanks, guys. Thank you, Amelia. You have a good day.